Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Annual Development Conference. It's really a pleasure for us in UNDP that you all are here. Can Ethiopia become a manufacturing powerhouse? That is our theme of the day. Why did the UNDP commission this study? One is that we looked a lot at the global empirical research and the experience of countries throughout the world. Almost all countries have used manufacturing as a way to have jobs and growth. There's a lot of academic work by Lodrick and Macmillan on this topic. Two is we're trying to provide a balanced and a holistic assessment of the viability of manufacturing on the macro side, on the micro side, on the labor side, and give a kind of a big picture analysis. Number three is we're looking at policy options to jumpstart manufacturing. Four is what is new about our study? What we tried to do is, number one, we updated a lot of the empirics. Number two is that we did a firm-level survey in collaboration with the Addis Ababa Chamber of Commerce. Number three is we conducted on-site field visits to Hawassa Industrial Park, Mekelle Industrial Park, RT, to see some FDI firms, and we've had a lot of meetings with government and private sector representatives. Also, we've brought in the political economy and governance angle, which seems to be of salience lately. And finally, we take a lot of the lessons from Asia and we do cross-country benchmarking, which is a big fad among economists that we like to do. And finally, with His Excellency the Minister, we wanted to time our work with the great initiatives that the Ministry of Industry is doing in forging a new industrial strategy, and also there are ongoing macro discussions between the IMF and the government, and we hope to inform some of that debate. Next slide, please. I'm going to begin with global. 7 features we have to understand about the world we're living in that I think will give context. Number one, the world is not in a good place. We have a difficult global and national environment. Number two, in Ethiopia and in many other countries, manufacturing has been stagnant, but it is necessary for structural transformation and jobs. The manufacturing is stagnant and necessary for structural transformation and jobs. Our third key finding is that Ethiopia has considerable assets and a lot of potential. Our fourth key finding is there are certain unique features in Ethiopia that are linked to the political economy that we will get into. Our fifth finding is that there are significant manufacturing challenges in Ethiopia: macro, finance, logistics, land, political economy, skills, and regulation. The sixth finding is that the industrial park strategy, which has been very valiantly launched over a decade ago, has had a mixed results. And our final finding is that there's a large potential for increase to US $10 billion by 2030, conditional on reforms. Next slide, please. What is the world situation while we are doing this paper? The 7 key factors to keep into account is that there's a slowdown in global growth after multiple shocks. That if you go back to 2019, nobody anticipated the combination of COVID, Ukraine, Gaza. All these shocks have happened. So we have a slowdown. Number two, we have the beginning of a fragmentation of the world system, rise of emerging markets and geopolitical blocs, especially the US-China rivalry. Number three, we have selective deglobalization and regionalism. In goods, there's a lot of trade. In some of the sensitive technology, we're seeing fragmentation. Fourth is we're seeing the end of the era of cheap money. Central bankers in 2010 were flooding the markets with money. Now everybody was talking about deflation. Now everybody's talking about inflation. And so interest rates have to be high to contain the inflation. The next one is the rise of artificial intelligence, robotics. Then green transition and decarbonization, as Charu said, COP28. This is the big unstoppable trend, is to decarbonize. And finally, we're seeing demographic shifts in the world. The projections are that 1/3 of all people will be African in 2100. Next slide, please. You can just see from the IMF the latest growth projections of global growth. You can see that Asia is doing well, Africa is okay, some of Europe, US has been lower, and you can see the kind of tensions in the global growth scenarios. Next slide. These are the shocks, right? In 2019, none of us anticipated this. Gaza, Ukraine, inflation, COVID, and the northern Ethiopia war, we only anticipated climate change, just to give you a flavor of what unprecedented times we live in. Next. Okay, now we come to Ethiopia. I'm not going to do an extensive macro, but the point I want to make is Ethiopia has faced some macroeconomic stresses. And the major one, a good one to show, is the gap between the parallel and the official exchange rate, which is a metric for the competitiveness of an economy and its credibility. And as you can see, the birr is at 105 in the black market and 54 in the official. And we are also seeing that Ethiopia had a huge development boom 2014, 15, 16, and that's recently started to come down. So Ethiopia is facing some of the shocks. Next slide, please. What is our storyline on manufacturing? This is the core of our study. Number one is the manufacturing sector has been nascent. It has stayed relatively at 5%. It's recently at 4.6%. Ethiopia is a political economy and a society of traders, not of manufacturers. That's our first kind of finding. Second is we've seen data from government that there's been some reduction of firms in the last 2-3 years, especially in the different regions, but some of them are coming back. We've also seen some of the FDI investors like Orange or like Pepsi maybe not wanting to come. Then we are seeing domestic private sector in Ethiopia. It's mostly SMEs in terms of number of firms, but in terms of total size, it's the large and medium-term firms. Women are the backbone of the IPs. Very important point. The role of women is totally understated. Women are the ones who are doing all the processing in the garment factories and a high labor force participation rate. One of the challenges we had is to look at the conglomerates. Ethiopia has 20+ conglomerates, but because they don't have open books and consolidated balance sheets, we couldn't get a precise empirical estimate, but we see that they span many sectors and they are quite important in the economy. Most firms produce domestically, they don't produce for exports. Only 5% of firms produce for exports. And then we have the 18 industrial parks, which has been launched in 2011, 12, I think. Yeah, next, please. Okay, so you see for data from the World Bank, you see that manufacturing as a share of GDP has been quite low. And you can see that orange point, right? Ethiopia construction is booming, service sector is booming, agriculture has been a bit up and down, but you get the sense of manufacturing stagnation. Next slide, please. Once again, the share of manufacturing is relatively stagnant, and the point we want to highlight is export volume. We are seeing that Ethiopian exports are starting to decline in volume, and there's some concerns we have about that trend. And you can see it in a bunch of things. So, next slide, please. When we get to IMF thinking, the core macroeconomic problem in Ethiopia is the current account sustainability. Ethiopia has 17.5 billion of imports and 3 billion of exports. So that gap has to be paid for by foreign exchange, by remittances, by many things. That gap creates a lot of problem. You can see Bangladesh, Cambodia. Cambodia is a landlocked country, by the way, but they have had huge success in exports in the last decade. So Ethiopia is stagnant. Kenya, the neighbor, is almost double of Ethiopia. So I wanted to put that in. Next. Nowadays, there seems to be a bit of pessimism among some people about Ethiopia. So I want to go back to first principles. What is the country's assets? Many countries in the world would love to be located where Ethiopia is. You talk to people from Mauritius, they say we are in the middle of nowhere. Ethiopia is located in the Horn of Africa, one of the central corridors of maritime traffic. Number two, the growing female labor force participation. Ethiopia has amazing endowments of land. It's the water tower of Africa due to high precipitation volumes. You have this amazing dam that's being built with installed capacity of 5,000 megawatts that could become export of energy. Ethiopia is quite green, by the way. It's not doing coal. 80% of its energy is coming from hydro. Very important point. You have the trifecta, what I call competitive wages, subsidized energy, and cheap industrial land. Ethiopia, from a business proposition, is a competitive economy. Next slide. Sorry, it's a large domestic market. Sorry, back, I forgot one point. And you have a capable state. You have a history of reforms. Next slide, please. Look at the cost of energy. How many of you knew this? It's very cheap to do energy in Ethiopia. So, okay, next slide. Okay, now we're going to get to the more complex issues. As you know, UN, we have to be balanced. What are the unique challenges of Ethiopia? We find 4 unique challenges in the area of kind of political economy, shall we call it. Number one is that it's a country where in the last couple of years there's not peace and stability throughout the territory. There's an elusive quest for political settlement, which means that businesses are a little bit apprehensive to invest in some parts of the country. Secondly, there's a kind of deficit in consensus building, institutional independence, consultation. You have different players, and there isn't a consensus on reform. And what we discovered in our interviews is there seems to be a trust deficit between the public sector and the private sector. This was quite notable. As someone like me who's worked in Asia, I was quite surprised to see this level of deficit of trust. The private sector has complained in many of the interviews of policy uncertainty. What's going to happen to the birr? Is this policy going to stay? Is this policy going to change? So there's this sense of uncertainty. The fourth point I want to make is Ethiopia risks fragmenting into multiple regional markets. We're already seeing preliminary data that there's barriers to movement of labor and capital throughout the country. Some firms are not going somewhere, some banks are not going somewhere. You have ethnic blended banking. You have some problem of coordination between the levels of government. This is not a fully unified market. We are seeing some data on that. Next slide, please. Okay, our core assessment based on our survey and our interviews is that there's 6 constraints to Ethiopia manufacturing. We can debate the magnitude of each of these constraints. One is bureaucracy. A lot of private sector firms are complaining of endless procedures, of customs, of paperwork, of processes. Number 2 is logistics. I'm going to get into that. Number 3 is finance. 4 is land. 5 is skills. And 6 is macro instability, including exchange rate. Next slide, please. Access to finance. Whenever we talk to firms, that's almost the number one thing, their preoccupation. What is the concern about finance? The concern about finance is that money is not flowing to the private sector at the levels at which entrepreneurs need. You see the gray is traders. Banks are much more likely to lend to traders than they are to manufacturers. There was a peak and now it's gone down. The entrepreneurs complain of high collateral requirement, high interest rates. The banks, when you talk to banks, they say manufacturers are risky, we don't trust them, they don't have the right models. SMEs are especially hit by this. And the DBE has a mixed record, there's some improvement, but there's this feeling that there's a bit of a gap, and I'll get a bit later on to this. Next. Skills mismatch. This is a very important point. Ethiopia has considerable investment in skills in the last 10, 15 years. The TVET programs have been ambitious, they've been expensive, and they've been noteworthy. And so the TVET programs have helped build skills for entrepreneurs, workers, but we have one statistic which is still puzzling. The unemployment of TVET graduates is at close to 50% in 2022. Are the TVET programs, what is concerns of the International Growth Center, that there's problems of quality, there's problems of lack of private sector involvement, and people are overqualified but underexperienced. I've been thinking a lot about this. When you travel with Ethiopian Air, you see Ethiopian skills are second to nobody in the world. But then when you get to specific sectors, then you don't maybe have those skills. One of the industrialists in Hawassa told us that they asked Ethiopian entrepreneurs to come to the industrial park. But some of the entrepreneurs came, but they said, we don't have knowledge of the textile industry and the garment industry. So there seems to be some knowledge gap in certain sectors. We aren't sure if it's due to the historical kind of inward trends in Ethiopia, but you see it a lot in the data as we present. Next. Costly logistics. This was a shock to me, to be honest with you. I didn't know Ethiopia. I've been here a year and a half, but we assembled the data. We've interviewed the firms. Ethiopia is extremely costly for logistics. And logistics is a very important thing, especially for a landlocked country. One reason why Switzerland is rich is because it has easy logistics with its neighbors. Ethiopia has the port of Djibouti is the handling fees are very expensive, $1.5 billion Ethiopia pays. Along the World Bank Logistic Performance Index, Ethiopia is ranked very high. It's higher than the competitors. You have a monopoly, ELSC, that dominates the sector. Private sector is not allowed to do multimodal transport. Now, in most parts of the world, shipping is a private sector industry. Private sector is a genius at shipping. So Ethiopia is kind of an outlier in not allowing private sector to do multimodal. And inland transportation is even more costly. So for exporters, by the time you process your good and you take it overseas, you're paying too much. You're paying double. Just to give you a sense, when I interviewed people in Shanghai and in Dhaka, their cost of sending to Long Beach, California, is 1/2 the cost from sending from Addis or from Hawassa. Logistics matters a lot. Micro matters. Next, land. We can have a whole day on land. It's a sensitive issue. That's why I use the word complexities. By constitution, land is owned by the state and the people of Ethiopia. There's no land market in Ethiopia, but there's a land lease policy that investors can use. There's a very good study of the Gates Foundation that says that they can improve. There's some ambiguities about land. The regulations of land, on allocations and investors between the federal and regional governments, and also there's a lack of clarity on land. Who are the investors in Ethiopia? What land do they have? Where's the size and the location? Where are the maps? There's a bit of non-transparency on the land market, we believe. Next. And land challenges, I'll come to that. Okay, governance. Okay, yeah, that's good. Next one, yeah. Governance. Okay, governance is a hot potato, but somebody's got to talk about it. I'm going to talk about it. There's growing concerns about corruption. When we speak to private sector people, when you look at the surveys of the Anti-Corruption Commission, they're saying that there's increasing problems doing business, taxation, customs, payments to access services. The Federal Ethics Anti-Corruption Commission of Ethiopia did a survey. They found that 85% of households in Ethiopia perceive that there exists corruption in public institutions. This is Ethiopian citizens. Now, Transparency International, which is an amalgamation of a number of surveys, sees Ethiopia as a midpoint. So The consolation for Ethiopia is the country is far worse, according to Transparency International, but there's many countries far better. Crony capitalism, there's a very good paper of Professor Alemayo Geda in which he's looking at the nexus between business and government. And what is, especially as you liberalize, what is that relationship? Is it a cozy relationship? Is it a fair relationship? Next slide, please. We did our survey based on all of this, and we worked with the Artists Chamber of Commerce. It was an anonymous survey. It was conducted for 2-3 months. We can't say it's fully representative. We have 70 firms, but we think based on the other enterprise surveys of World Bank and stuff, we think it's quite indicative. What is a major finding of, we interviewed all kinds of firms. We asked them 35 questions. We got very good responses. Next slide, please. So this for me is the core of the crux of the problem of Ethiopia. Most firms say, what is your top 3 challenges to doing business? Number 1, overwhelming, is finance. Number 2 is Forex, which goes back to the exchange rate. The gap between the supply of Forex and the demand for Forex as registered in the black market is a huge constraint. Number 3 is bureaucracy. Then we asked them, why aren't you expanding? And the firms say finance is the overwhelming reason, and then Forex and land is second. So we want this to be a kind of this is the mood and the pulse of the Ethiopian private sector. Next slide, please. You have some firms are upgrading technology. Entrepreneurial capacity, half the firms claim they're self-taught. There's something that was a puzzle to me when I was looking at the data. Ethiopian entrepreneurs are a little bit isolated. In Asia, you have a lot of diaspora networks. You have a lot of movement of ideas and knowledge. Ethiopian entrepreneurs seem more isolated in the data. We can get into that. And only 9% of firms get their thing from entrepreneurial networks. Next. EU, a survey that was done last year, has found similar. EU says that there was a problem with business climate. They still see, investors still see Ethiopia as a good market for investment and turnover, but there's problems of competitiveness, Forex, and the EU trifecta, the survey investors, is regulation, infrastructure, and security. Security is coming up a lot more in our more recent interviews. Next slide, please. Industrial parks. The story of industrial parks, we can go into Q&A, I don't want to get too long, it was a very promising. East Asia is trying to replicate the model of Bangladesh, China, which was to build these beautiful industrial parks. How many of you have been to an industrial park? Raise your hand. Okay, not bad. I've been in 10 countries. I love industrial parks. The Ethiopian industrial park has been fantastic for exports, jobs, and externalities. The IPs, this is World Bank data, IPs reached 163 million of exports. They've hired 150,000 workers in 22. There's still problems with industrial parks, but it was a very promising experiment, and it has delivered quite a bit. The challenges, and the parks were meant to be in all parts of the country. Some are more active than others. Hawassa was quite active. The problem of industrial park was the logistics, the imports. They weren't linked to the SMEs. There's questions on the AGOA suspension. Once Ethiopia lost AGOA, they lost a lot of textile exports. Security problem. We are not seeing a lot of domestic investors in the industrial parks. When you talk to the industrial parks, they say domestic investors are not interested. When you talk to domestic investors, they say government wants foreign investors. We are in a puzzle. We would discuss that in the Q&A. World Bank did a very good work on that the industrial park thing has to be more strategic, and there should be feasibility studies and more sequencing of demand, of development based on occupancy. That when I worked in China and Vietnam, the parks that were near the big cities did very well. The parks in remote areas did less well. Next slide, please. These are Hawassa and Mekelle field visits. Next. Um, this is a panorama of Ethiopian manufactured products. Next slide, please. Okay, we did an analysis using a bit of Harvard economic complexity. Ethiopia tends to export the same things it did 10 years ago. The Harvard view has an analysis called the long jump. Why don't you diversify your exports? You know, countries like Chile, they used to produce agriculture and copper. Now all of a sudden they're producing, you know, high-level horticulture, industrial products. You know, China moved from one to the other. What are the possibilities of having a long jump approach and low-hanging fruit? Next slide. Okay, so our analysis, this is a very important thing of our analysis. What we argue in our UNDP paper is, number one, Ethiopia has huge potential to increase based on 3 parameters. One is we looked at the Harvard data. 2 is we consulted with experts in each of the sectors. 3 is we looked at the global demand. What we understand about coffee is it has a lot of challenges of governance and of supply chain, but the coffee potential of Ethiopia is immense, including the processing of coffee. Number 2, gold. There's a political economy that's very difficult in gold, but gold can boom. Horticulture we find to be very promising, and many of the other sectors are also energy with the dam, oil seeds. These are very promising sectors. On the long jump, we have a few concerns. One is that we think electronics, Ethiopia can be assembly of electronics. We have some concerns with pharma. Ethiopia is doing pharma, but we aren't sure that the quality of pharma will be acceptable to international export markets. Horticulture, we're more ambitious. We think there's a lot of potential. Next slide. So this gives you, and the working paper has a lot more detail. This gives you a sense of our vision that Ethiopia, just to summarize this point, that Ethiopia has potential to improve its traditional exports through better governance. It has an ability to process much more, especially horticulture and coffee. It has sectors that are new, energy and electronics, and it has other sectors that you have to fix some of the underlying problems, such as leather, with you know, the sector-specific issues. And AGOA, if AGOA is removed, I think textiles can boom. We have done the assumption AGOA is not removed in our analysis, but we are open to hoping it changes. Next. Quickly on East Asia, and I'm just going to wrap up. East Asia, what did we learn? We learned the importance of keeping your exchange rate competitive, macro stability. The Korean example is the best. The Koreans said, okay, you want to export, we'll give you money, but give us export orders, carrot and stick. So they targeted exports. Land never became a major issue. Directed credit, heavy investment, and I'm very glad, Minister, that the Ethiopian government is doing some of this now. Next, please. Reforms. This is going to be the 5 areas of reform that we propose. Political and macro stability, firm capabilities, land management, private sector constraint, trade and industrial policy. Next slide. Okay, here's our top 10 reforms. And then I'm going to wrap up. Number 1, it's an anomaly to have such a gap between the official and the parallel exchange rate. Now, there's a debate on how you change it, the modalities, we can get into that, the timing. An exchange rate that's overvalued is a subsidy on imports and a tax on exports. This is not making Ethiopia competitive. We believe in the progressive, phased unification of the birr. Number 2, monetary policy. The central bank is now financing the deficits, but Ethiopia needs what in macroeconomics we call an anchor. They need a monetary policy that's stable with control of inflation. Number 3, let's restart the public-private dialogue. All these PPD forums seem to have been abandoned. And Ethiopia, private sector is smart, government is smart, they have to talk to each other. Number 4, Transparent portal on land. Land is hard to find out all the data, and I think it's very important for investors to know because there's so much potential and possibilities. Number 5, this might be heterodox thinking in Ethiopia, but government considered it in 2020 to bring in private sector in multimodal logistics. Private sector drives down costs. The more private sector you have in logistics, the more the costs go down. Number 6, strengthen technological capabilities of firms. Firms are not on the cutting edge of technology. They can be supported with government, with private sector and foreign investors, partner, joint ventures. 7, let's further dynamize the TVET program. Let's link skills to labor market like the Canadians do. When the Canadians do immigration, they say we need 100,000 nurses, and then they plan ahead. Ethiopia should think we need how many million people in this sector, in that sector, in this sector, in 20 years, 10 years, and then make a plan. The Canadians have the model for it in immigration. Next, revamp industrial park strategy. I am a strong believer in industrial parks. Ministry of Industry and many of the others have supported it. There's people who criticize industrial parks, and I say industrial parks have achieved quite a bit. We need a mid-course collection, and we're so happy Ministry of Industry is doing a strategic rethink of the industrial parks. To include SME linkages. Next, the final point is financial sector. Sorry, just up one. Financial sector, let's come up with creative solutions. Bring in foreign banks, new instruments, strengthen DBE. You have so much money in Ethiopia. Some of it's going to Dubai, some of it's going capital flight, some of the diaspora money, no one knows where it is. Bring it in, build companies, build firms. This is the future of this country. China took off because all the diaspora investors invested in Shenzhen, Guangdong. They put their money, they have their ancestral homes there. Ethiopian diaspora can come and start putting money. There's so much money, but it's not coming in the industries. Final, gender. Women are doing so much in Ethiopia. Their work is not compensated enough. They are not acknowledged. We need gender strategies to really acknowledge and support women, including the women in Hawassa who are making a little bit too little money. We believe in a minimum wage. That's a floor. Ethiopia will still be competitive, even at $50 minimum wage. At the moment, it's like between 25 and 40. We believe in a minimum wage, especially to protect women. In a nutshell, Ethiopia has a lot of potential. We believe in it. We think there can be some key strategic reforms. We look forward to the Q&A and the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ali, don't move. We will take a few questions. Our next speaker is ready online, but I think it's only fair to take maybe 5 questions, and then we can come back. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Zafar. I'm from Manufacturing Powerhouse. I just want to say thank you very much. That is spot on presentation from a private sector perspective, because we work in finance investment advisory and we build with a number of sectors here in Ethiopia. And most of the presentation that you're laying out is the challenge conversation that I keep having with my clients, with all our clients at the firm. So I just want to say it's really spot on presentation, and thank you for doing that research. And one thing I want to emphasize on, not a question, one thing I want to emphasize on is, I think now, and also in my personal view, we Ethiopians have come to the point we need to have honest to God conversation when it comes to land reform. Honest to God conversation, because at the end of the day, every economy, land is a huge asset, right? And in a country where there's 120 million people, and the projection is will be 200 million by the mid-century, around 2050, we need to have a strong conversation regarding land privatization.
Of course, there's a number of things to be discussed, but otherwise, with the current agriculture that we have, where the farmers have, like all the farmers in Ethiopia has like on average 0.5 to 1 hectare, you cannot grow your agriculture sector. You just can't. There's no economics of productivity. I mean, you could do the production, but you're not gonna have productivity because of, again, it's connected to the land. And more importantly, the land is correlated with the growth of credit, especially as Ethiopia expand on the urbanization, right? So I think stressing the land reform, having honest-to-God conversation regarding land privatization is a very much important thing. Because I know that the government is going to have a homegrown economic reform plan 2.0. I don't know if anybody is there from a government. I think it's better to take it as a recommendation. Thank you, Ali. It was a really good presentation.
Access to finance? Is that what their problem is? Access to finance? Because I find the contrary. Ethiopia has too easy access to finance for some people that they shouldn't. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we have. So if you go to any other country in East Africa, whether it is Rwanda or Uganda, to actually get access to finance, you need to show that you have brought your money, and you have to create your own collateral before you can actually borrow money from any private bank. Whilst in Ethiopia, access to finance, on the contrary, is quite open, which one would say it's a good thing if it is used properly. So is that the question? Access to finance, they cannot get money easily? Is that what they were complaining about?
Thank you. Thank you for your nice analysis in the presentations. You have analyzed the situations, the trend of industries in Ethiopia, the challenges, the potential what we have, and where we can achieve by 2030 as targeted. It's a nice explanation. My ideas I need on clarification is you have addressed the challenges regarding to non-tax issues about finance, logistics, lands, infrastructure, transports, and others. Have you seen the tax issues, the tax parties, regarding it to, you have little elaborated about regarding it to the corruption, but how you see the tax incentives and the tax policies to encourage these manufacturing sectors to capitalize their potentials? Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for the presentation. My name is Faisal Hashi. I'm with USAID. Speaking of ports, we know that Ethiopia relies on Djibouti 95%. Why not diversify? We know Berbera port, just the other side, is underutilized. Why not diversify ports? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali, for the presentation. My name is Theodros. I'm from the International Growth Center. Happy to see that some of our findings are also cited there. I wanted to add a few more points, and I wanted to see if those are relevant, especially on the industrial parks. One is the issue of linkages, domestic, in parks, firms in the industrial parks linking with other manufacturing or other firms within domestically, because that's one of the big problems. I think the World Bank has also done a bit of that. You have not also mentioned the level of labor turnover. I know that you've mentioned the skills gap, but also the turnover issue and the incentives system built in there. Another point, very, very quickly, is your survey finding of finance versus forex. I saw that finance was a bigger problem compared to the forex issue. Maybe I'm really interested to see your methodology, because the perception can be sometimes sort of mixed between the two. The finance and the forex issue could be mixed, which is why on the growth question, they mention finance as a big problem rather than other constraining factors, because some firms, even if their finance is accessible at the moment, they may not be able to access inputs, which will defeat the growth issue. So I think that should be looked at further before presenting, because finance has been improving the past few years. A lot of finance has been going to the private sector, but I think the other constraints are more important in my view. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to add one more question. For the way forward, I think there is a need for sustainable manufacturing, to adopt sustainable manufacturing practices. I just want to know what are the achievements in Ethiopia in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sagamlak from Sagamlak Solomon and Associates Law Office. Thank you, Ali, for your excellent presentation. I think you brought passion to the deserved manufacturing sector, and I think it's a well-deserving sector. More or less my comments are, one, on the disparity, like in the challenges that the manufacturing sector is facing. Also, access to finance, as mentioned earlier, is one of the primary challenges. I am surprised to see that much disparity in how escalated the issue is compared to other issues such as bureaucracy and land issues, corruption included in bureaucracy as well. So, because I have been facing, of course, representing my clients with different government offices who are supposed to be there to facilitate, support the manufacturing sector, but mostly they end up being bureaucratic and blocks for any move towards growth, right? So, how is that highlighted in your surveys or research is more or less my question. I'm surprised to see it way below in the areas of challenges. And the other one is land, again. Land in terms of transparency associated with land. I'm not sure. I have been to, for example, one of the manufacturing hubs, which is Devra Burhan, looking for land with a client, and we are surprised to notice that there was no one from government office wanting to meet us, to tell us where to go and how to access land, except these commission agents who connect you with other investors who acquired land from the government but are just holding the land for passing it through to another investor, right? So while the government is there, while that's happening in its front, in its gate, how is access to land being treated by the government? And I would it's not, of course, for you to answer, but more or less to get a comment from you. The other one is you have talked a lot about industrial parks, but I found them to be in design, they are poorly designed. For example, you can see the Clinton Industrial Park, which is designed for pharmaceutical. I'm not sure, in the heart of Addis Ababa, having a pharmaceutical industrial park, and it's still empty, right? It has been empty for a while. So that shows poor design, right? And even we say that AGOA is the reason for most of the industrial park issues that we are having currently, but isn't a problem in design to make it rely on one market in the first place is more or less my question, right? So industrial parks, of course, they are good in terms of job creation, and but are we designing them properly? And I found them to be too expensive, or all my clients found them to be too expensive, and also there is a specific requirement for forex payment, even for foreign investors. Of course, initially they might make payments in forex, but going forward, if they are focusing on domestic market, there is no way for you to focus on domestic market as the way they are structured. You need to be an exporter to be an industrial park. So it's not only domestic investors issue, it's even foreign investors they cannot target domestic markets if they are planning to join an industrial park, right? So, like, what do you see, like, how do you see those challenges associated with industrial parks is more or less my question. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent questions. I won't answer all of them because a bunch of them, especially in the parks, we'll discuss during the panel, during the roundtable. But let me get to a few of the key ones, and then Haile can step in, especially on land and finance. So, number one, regional integration. Ethiopia historically has been protectionist and has been inward-looking. It's not an active participant in the East African community. The scope for regional integration is there. I'm not sure if the payoff is huge. We can get into the debate. Kenya, Ethiopia, many of them export similar goods, you know, and there might be more scope for regional markets throughout Africa. We can get into that. Number two, finance, Heliana, thank you. Look, we have two different strands of the research. When we talk to SMEs, when you interview SMEs, when we interview some of the firms, it's a repeated complaint from the private sector that we interview that the collateral requirements are too high, that the banks only want to talk to traders. The banks don't believe in manufacturing. Now, then you have the other argument, which is very hard as an outsider to verify, is the insider-outsider argument, which is which firms are politically connected to banks, which firms are not politically connected to banks. So there's the whole Alemayo stream, which is about crony capitalism. We couldn't verify that in the surveys. We got the comments from the firms directly that they were facing struggle with access to finance. So we take them at face value. Most of the firms, there may be some very politically connected firms that don't have problem, but we have not been able to talk to those firms. So we can get into it in the roundtable. On the land issue, listen, land is a hot potato, but land has to be talked about. The United States in 1870 created a land market after the Civil War, you know. The Singaporeans have figured out a solution. Land is an asset. It should not be so politically contentious. But somehow, you can even have the government own the land. The horticulture people told us that they get the leases and they're happy with the leases. So you have ways of working on the land modality. On tax incentives, good question. Nobody complained on the tax incentives for businesses. The manufacturers are very happy with the fiscal regime. Where people complain is the customs and tax authorities are overtaxing people. And I think that's a recurrent complaint on the revenue side, but not on the incentive side for businesses. Logistics, I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled why Ethiopia doesn't have a different logistics strategy, in the sense that it's located in the heart of like one of the most important places in the world, where every foreign country has geopolitical interest. If Mauritius can manage to create leverage, Ethiopia has to come up with a convincing logistics strategy. Using ports of other countries, making deals. I believe the other ports are much cheaper, and there should be diversification. And the monopoly, for me, you have to introduce competition to the Ethiopian shipping and logistics. Bring in competition. And like you did with Orange, with Ethio Telecom and Safaricom. Finance versus Forex, that's a really good question. It was very hard to get people to respond to 35 questions. We asked them Forex and finance. It's worth doing a follow-up analysis of decomposing the difference between the two. Given the time, the budget, and the difficulty of getting responses, it was not easy to answer that. Sustainable manufacturing, it's a dream, but first you need manufacturing. Then you can get sustainable, right? When I was in Bangladesh, and Masroor will talk about it, firms complain to me all the time that they end up going green and then the buyers don't charge them lower and lower prices. So there's no, it's a huge financial cost to going green. At the UNDP, we believe fully in green and sustainable, but we have to find a way to make it economical for firms. I wanted Haile to talk about financial land, just briefly if you can.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the land issue, I think, as you all know, land is constitutional. Constitutionally owned by the public or the people, but how land is administered, as you know, through the lease system, urban land can be leased for 99 years, for businesses up to 60. But the problem is, there is problem of land administration in administrating the lease system or in accessing the land. In our study, what we should show is to appreciate land issue is a problem, just appreciating the problem. Given that this is constitutional, I don't think everyone has the answer for that, but we would like to appreciate as a problem for businesses, for manufacturing, because it's expensive. If you see land auction prices, you would hear on the media that the prices are high compared to even some expensive countries elsewhere in the world, implying that there are issues of land administration and that should be addressed. And we would like to appreciate the problem. That's what I can say. With regard to access to finance, yes, you already touched it on. When we ask firms in our survey, the number one problem they mentioned is access to finance. To scale up their businesses, to start businesses, number one constraint is they lack access to, they don't get finance. So again, we want to show this also to appreciate access to finance, number one problem. And the purpose of this study, this conference is also to steer discussions, debate on these issues and appreciate the problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Listen, this is not an end. We will pursue, we have a round table, and we will pursue many of these topics in a bit more depth. Thank you.